Good afternoon and welcome. This is an invited speaker session, and we have two speakers this afternoon and two very different topics. And the first speaker is an author of really spellbinding histories of science and scientific stories. And she's going to talk on bias from overt to unconscious and what research suggests that we can do. And I have really a personal recommendation that I want to say before she starts, and that is she wrote a book with a very long title called The Theory That Would Not Die: How Bayes' Rules Cracked the Enigma Code, Hunted Russian submarines, and emerged triumphant from 2 centuries of controversy. And it's really an exceptional book that I'd highly recommend to everyone. And her first book was about Nobel Prize women in science. And her next book, that I don't know if she'll talk about at all, is with Rita Caldwell, a renowned scientist and actually former director of the NSF. So with that brief introduction, I'd like to welcome Sharon Bertsch McGrayne, sorry. One other thing, we'll have hopefully some time after each session for questions, but I'll also be gathering any questions that are submitted online. So feel free during the talk to submit your questions online. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me and for coming today and for being interested in diversity. I start out with 4 caveats. I'm not a scientist, not a computer scientist. I write books about scientists and the history of science. Second, I am not going to presume to talk about computer science today. You all know far more about it than I ever will. I'm going to be talking instead a lot about gender diversity in the life sciences. And the reason is that women in microbiology have been studying bias in science, and many of the problems that your professional organizations are dealing with today. Only they started doing it 45 years ago and are still at it. And because most women study and work in the biological sciences, that's where many of the biggest data sets have been. And I hope that the experience of the women in microbiology can serve as a model for other underrepresented groups. All that said, I'm going to start with some ancient history so we can see how bad things were in science in the old days. Then we'll go to some modern history with the Title IX era. And finally, we'll see what's happening now, because there have been tremendous advances, although there's still much that can be done. But I know you folks like data, so I will start by describing the lay of the land for women in academia during most of the 20th century, beginning in the 1920s. That'll give us a baseline. For most of the 20th century, in the United States, a woman's path to a career in science consisted of a series of obstacles. And they were a set of discriminatory practices that were perfectly legal, and they were sometimes even enshrined into laws. 3 in particular: anti-nepotism rules. Modern version says relatives don't supervise relatives. For most of the 20th century, university regulations or state laws said that a university couldn't hire the relatives of its employees. There were many, in general, many exceptions made for male relatives, for sons, uncles, brothers, and so on, but not for the wives. And these regulations and laws were devastating for the women because so many of them were married to other scientists. A rather spectacular example, it was a woman physicist named Maria Geppert-Mayer, who won a Nobel Prize in Physics in 1963. She was married to a chemistry professor, so she worked for 30 years in leading American universities at Johns Hopkins, Columbia, and the University of Chicago as a volunteer without pay, no pension rights, and so on. She worked her way up from voluntary researcher all the way up through the years to be a voluntary professor. They called her voluntary, not volunteer, okay? And then she had all of the responsibilities of a paid faculty member. She advised graduate students, she taught classes, she helped hire other faculty, published, university responsibilities, but she didn't get paid by a university until 10 years after her Nobel Prize-winning research. Now, besides these anti-nepotism rules, there were two other problems that life scientists in particular were hit by. The two routes to research were either medical school training or a PhD. Women could not get into medical schools. There were quotas that said that either banned women entirely or would permit one per year. The other route, of course, is to get a fellowship for a PhD, but those also went only to men. There were lots of fellowships for women for one-year programs to get masters, and that would train them to be laboratory technicians. But fellowships for a PhD, that was quite a different matter. Rita Caldwell, for example, has been mentioned earlier. She was the first woman director of the National Science Foundation, and so far the only biologist. She was told that she couldn't have a fellowship for a PhD because they weren't given to women, and the only degree she'd get, her department chairman told her, was in the maternity ward of a hospital. And she had to switch fields 5 or 6 times before she got her PhD advisor. So during the old days, we are not talking about subtleties here, okay? In all 3 cases, anti-nepotism, medical school admittance, and PhD fellowships, it was not academia that ended these discriminatory practices. It was the US Congress. The Congress responded to a critical shortage of physicians by funding new medical school, a whole bunch of them in the 1960s, especially in the 1970s, and women flocked into them. Then in the early 70s, Congress banned discrimination against women in universities that were getting federal aid. And for example, everyone knows that that allowed women to have athletic programs, but it also opened university faculties and fellowships for women. This brings us to the modern history, the post-Title IX era. When starting in the 1970s, we begin to see some subtleties, with small incremental changes taking place over the next 35 years. Changes that were made because of a lot of work done by a lot of women and a lot of men. The fact that they were small incremental changes doesn't mean they weren't important. The mantra at the time was whenever a woman complained about something, she'd be told, "You're making a mountain out of a molehill. Don't you have a sense of humor?" That's what women say, all of it, that's their memory. But there is a large body of social science now called the accumulation of advantage that shows how piling little molehills on top of each other can indeed make a mountain of problems. The steps were small because the universities did not respond to the new laws quickly. University boards of trustees almost overnight modified the anti-nepotism rules in 1971, 72, 73, are the dates that I find when there's a written record about it. Oops, sorry. A decade after Title IX, many departments started hiring a token woman, as an assistant professor. This was not just in biology, of course, it was in many fields. And many of these male faculty members had never dealt with a female colleague or peer at the time, and frankly found it a trifle confusing. For example, Lynn Caporal was hired as Georgetown's token woman by the biochemistry department. And she was going in to give her first lecture to several hundred medical students when a very kind but really confused male professor stopped her in the hall and said, "Lynn, if you're nervous, you could wear a see-through blouse." Caporali thought, wow, I really should have thought of that myself. Another reason for the slow pace of change was the lack of believable data documenting the problems. And one of the major accomplishments of the feminist movement was to show women scientists, who often worked one to a department and didn't dare compare notes about their experiences with one another or with others, that their problems were not the result of their own personal failures, but in fact were built into the system. Now, fortunately, women, scientists rather, know how to do research. And in 1974, women in the life sciences undertook the first large and rigorously conducted scientific study of the condition of women, female PhD microbiologists. They had a statistician on board from the beginning. They worked with was computerized. They punched the cards in meetings at night with one another. And the results showed in 1974 that almost all the women in microbiology who obtained faculty positions were unmarried and without children. Women had assistant professorships paid far less than the men, but there were almost no female professors, absolutely no female department chairs, and no female administrators in American biology. With difficulty, they got the research published. And then they updated it for almost a decade with a graph showing that women earned less than the men and were promoted almost not at all. However, and I'm afraid this is important, as much as these studies convinced them and their male allies that women had real problems in science, these demographic studies by themselves did nothing substantial to better the condition of women in science. So the women got together again, tried to figure out where their biggest problem was, the biggest bottleneck, and they decided it was the presidencies in their professional organizations. Now, the American Society for Microbiology was and is the world's largest society for life scientists, and it had elected a woman president roughly, very roughly, every 20 years. Rita Caldwell becomes the fourth woman president in 1985, when it was already, our society was already 40% women. She kept trying to figure out how an organization that is 40% women could elect a president only every 20 or so years. And she finally discovered, it's a rinky-dink little thing, but she discovered that the slate of official nominees for the next year's officers and the directions for mounting a write-in campaign against them if you didn't like the slate were snail-mailed, of course, to members after the deadline for filing the write-in campaigns had passed. She discovers this a week before the deadline. No email at the time. The small group of women get together. They agree to back one candidate so their votes won't be split. They keep it a total secret so the old guard won't react. And they collected 100 signatures on the petition and got another woman elected. Actually, as you can see in red, they got 3 in a row elected. Then there was a man, then another woman, and so it went. And so they got elected, 7 out of the next decade were women. the executive director of the society told me that there was a period when no man would run because he knew if he ran, he'd be beaten by a woman. Now, once the women started getting to the society's leadership, they immediately got babysitters at the annual meetings. They beefed up the educational programs for those lab techs with masters. Women began getting some awards and prizes that had previously gone almost exclusively to men. And they also got a woman, Dean of the University of Rochester Medical School, Barbara Iglewski, to volunteer in whatever spare time she had to chair the Society's Publications Committee. And chipping away gradually, they made progress there. The Society published the leading journals in the field, and in 1986, 100% of the journal editors were men. Almost 100% of the reviewers were men, and the staffers were 100% men. So when they finally got a woman chosen as a journal editor, the women threw a party. Then came a truly transformational study that made headlines nationwide, that convinced not just biologists, but all scientists at large, the general public, and politicians, that discrimination really did exist in academic science. And it was published in 1999 about MIT. And it started when Nancy Hopkins, professor of microbiology at MIT, asked for more laboratory space for her zebra fish tanks that she used for genetics. She was turned down. She goes and talks to a small group of women professors in science at MIT who've been meeting, and they come to the conclusion that the problems they faced were institutional. So with the support of MIT's president and provost at the time, they quietly began gathering an enormous amount of very detailed data. They took tape measures and measured to the inch everyone's laboratories. They counted honors, computed summer salaries, compared committee assignments and workloads, and they documented the fact that women had fewer resources than men at MIT. And when the study made the front page headlines in the New York Times in 1999, the public outrage was such that President Bill Clinton invited Nancy Hopkins to the White House, and she went on a tour speaking to 100 American campuses. And today, of course, MIT is considered a national leader in helping young women succeed in science. So what's happening now in the 21st century? The 21st century has seen an enormous outpouring of research about diversity. The demographic research has shown women getting more than half of the PhDs in the life sciences, but only 36% of the assistant professorships, 18% of the full professorships, and in some places, 0% of the executives and board members and advisory committee members of the startups made from university-financed research. The demographics have identified places where there are big problems for women and some pretty strong clues as to what's happening. One of the areas that's cropped up is conferences like this one. Getting those speaking invitations to big conferences has been very difficult. It took the life sciences until the 1990s to open up the publications to women on an equal basis, but it wasn't until last year that the American Society for Microbiology stopped having male-only program committees that invited male-only speakers. And remembering, of course, that by now half of the PhDs go to women. Now, Arturo Casadeval from Hopkins and Joe Handelsman from Yale did a study showing that roughly half of the 200-odd sessions at the really big ASM meetings in 2011, 12, and 13 were organized by all male program committees, and roughly 30% of the Society's program committees invited only male speakers. And based on their own data, they found that the gap between male and female speakers could be closed fairly easily if each convener's committee had one woman on it. And that would reduce the number of women speakers by 72%. Well, Arturo Casadevall was chair of the Society's program committee for the general meetings for 2 years in a row, 2014 and 15. And he thought all he had to do was to make the program committees aware of the gender statistics, and everything would change. That didn't happen in 2014. So the next year, he said on that occasion, the committee was also instructed verbally to do better with regard to gender balance and to avoid all male sessions except under extraordinary circumstances. And in fact, the 2015 general meeting essentially achieved gender equity among the speakers, 45% of them being women. Now, conferences have another problem too, and that's sex. Sexual harassment of women trainees, graduate students, and postdocs. And Professor Ben Barres of Stanford, chair of the neuroanatomy department, has crusaded about that over the last several years. And I have to explain that Ben Barres is a beloved figure in biology. He started life, he got tenure as Barbara Barres. 15 years ago, he transgendered, so he's seen the problem from both sides. And he said the only time he really worried about his career was when he started campaigning on behalf of the women in science. He concluded that this, quote, "The simplest conclusion is that the dearth of women scientists is caused largely, if not totally, by bias and social factors, not because of a lack of innate ability." In talking with women trainees, he told me that he had learned that it is very common for them to be hit on by senior males at meetings. Many, he said, told him that this happens to them many times at every meeting, no matter how much they dress down. One trainee told him she was having what she thought was a fantastic science discussion with a male faculty member at her poster. And at the end of it, he wrote his hotel room number on her hand. Ben Barres is very ill with pancreatic cancer, but he took the time to tell me, "I don't want my trainees exposed to this. It gives them the message that they're not valued for their science and very effectively prevents them from networking with senior PIs." And over the past several years, he has said he'd been pestering the national meetings to create sexual harassment policies that everyone registering for the meeting would have to click acceptance of in order to get registered for the meeting. He told me that in my experience, and you'll find out why everybody likes Ben Barres, he said, "In my experience, gender things like this require great perseverance over many years, and usually frank bitchiness to get anything to happen." He said, "I'm pretty sure most men are well-meaning and do not behave this way, but there's a subset of men who take advantage of young women repeatedly, and if this is even 5% of the men, it could rapidly add up to harming the majority of women." Now, the biggest leak in the career path for women in the biological sciences occurs in the postdoc years and assistant professor years, which of course is when the tenure and motherhood issues coincide. It turns out that nearly half of young women scientists, according to studies, say that because of their careers, they have fewer children than they wanted. And SF says married women scientists with children are 35% less likely to get a tenure-track job than married men with children. And even in universities that build $250 million athletic stadiums, there's often no money for affordable daycare. Now, there's another problem during this critical period, is that the young women don't have the access to top training or top jobs that the men have. And the question was, could it be that the faculties themselves have gender biases? Now, universities choose the vast majority we've skipped one, but that's okay. Universities choose the vast majority, 83% of their junior faculty members in the biological sciences, from a few elite feeder labs. That is defined as one in a top university by someone who's won a Nobel Prize, who's a member of national academies, or has a Howard Hughes Medical Institute grant. And all these awards are awards that have been given predominantly to men for many years. And these men hire many fewer young women as their graduate students and postdocs than young men. And the more decorated the male professor is, the bigger the sex skew. In the laboratories of 22 male Nobel Prize winners in the life sciences, male postdocs outnumbered women postdocs 3-1. And remember, this is a field where half of the PhDs are earned by women. Now, as a result of studies like these, it seems obvious that when a student looks for a job, two things to consider are not only the level of the science, but also the level of the mentorship. And the suggestion has been made that the websites of all faculty members should list the names of their grad students and postdocs with their pictures, so we know, and then list what they're doing now, so that prospective students can tell whether the professor mentors his or her trainees well. Now, this is the study that I put up on the screen too early, I'm sorry, because this is another really transformational study, akin to the MIT one in the 1999. It's from 2012, Joe Handelsman from Yale did it. And it was a study showing that faculty members in the life sciences are biased they favor men. And Joe Handelsman told me that this was shocking to the profession because scientists pride themselves on being rational, fact-based, objective, recognizing quality instantly. I should explain that in the life sciences, it's perfectly standard after someone gets a PhD to then spend several years running someone's laboratory. That teaches them how to run a laboratory, then they can go on and get a postdoc and learn how to write winning grants. So this was the standard randomized double-blind study of 127 science faculty from research-intensive universities, applications sent to them to be a laboratory manager. All of the applications, of course, were exactly the same down to the commas. With the one exception, some were signed by a John and some were signed by Jennifer. And the faculty members, men and women, the top researchers, thought the man was more competent, that he was more hireable. They would hire him more than the woman. They would pay him thousands of dollars more in his starting salary, and they would offer him more mentoring. And this, needless to say, is very threatening to people who pride themselves on their objectivity. Now, continuing along the career path, in the life sciences, it's de rigueur now to have a big multi-million-dollar laboratory. And in a time of decreasing public support for grant money, they have to go hat in hand to the military, business, foundations, venture capitalists, and so on. All areas dominated by men where women are less likely to have connections. And here the transformational studies came, again, not from academia, but from the business world. Credit Suisse, McKinsey, and a host of others have transformed the question of diversity into a profit dollar sign issue by saying that businesses with women with diverse executive suites, boardrooms, advisory committees make more money than unisex corporations do. So why is all this happening? A psychologist named Claude Steele suggested that it was stereotype threat. He suggested in 1999 that stereotypes have an impact on our behavior. Steele's concept is quite simple. It says that members of a group with a negative stereotype, that is women in mathematics, African Americans in universities, if they're even subtly reminded of their membership in their group, they're under additional pressure and they underperform on tests. And dozens upon dozens of studies and experiments has confirmed this, that stereotype threat can affect performance in such vital arenas as golfing, safe driving, among older adults, memory performance, negotiations, financial decisions, and that it explains in large part why some students who enter college with exactly the same achievement levels on SAT scores as the other students underachieve. Now, Claude Steele tells a story about his 5-year-old grandson. Shortly after Freddie Gray died in a Baltimore police van, the Steeles were out in the car together for a ride. And Steele says, "My daughter is ethnically ambiguous. You'd have to be told she was African American. Her husband is African, born in Uganda, raised in the US, and they have," says the grandfather, "this beautiful grandson who is 5 years old, sitting in the back seat, driving along. All of a sudden, out of the total blue, comes this little voice. Mom, you're lucky because you don't look like Daddy, and people will like you." Well, as Claude Steele said, this sent the whole family into a tizzy. But the research says that picking up such negative stereotypes is just plain automatic. Mahzarin Banaji, now at Yale, and Anthony Greenwald at the University of Washington, figured out how to measure the amount of bias in an individual, the amount of bias that someone has on a variety of topics. The test measures what I would call unconscious bias, but psychologists like to call implicit bias because unconscious bias sounds too Freudian, okay? But it says that we operate on two levels. One is the rational one, the one we want to believe that we are behaving as. Okay? And the other is the unconscious one, and they both affect our behavior. Now, Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book about some of this called Blink, and he polled half of the companies on the Fortune 500 list. And they found that the male CEOs are much taller than the average American male. They're 6 foot tall compared to about 5'9". And Gladwell said it's ridiculous to think that companies go out and pick their CEOs by height, but that's what they're unconsciously doing. Now, Banaji and Greenwald figured out a way to measure the amount of bias with a test that's called, can we go backwards? Sorry. That will happen at some point. But it's called the Implicit Association Test website. And I have on a later slide the the link that you can use. It's on Harvard now. And it can measure the unconscious bias in milliseconds based on the fact that we make connections much more quickly between pairs of ideas that are unfamiliar to us than between pairs of ideas that are unfamiliar to us. And Bertsch and Greenwald stumbled on this by going through a deck of cards one day and separating the red cards over here, the hearts and the diamonds on the left, the black ones over here, spades and clubs on the right, and they took an average of 24 seconds to do that. But when they mixed up the colors, when they put the spades and diamonds on the left and the clubs and hearts on the right, it took 50% longer. And that's the principle basically behind this IAT test. The most popular, we can all take it, go on the web and take it. The most popular one to take is about race. The second most popular one is, I am sorry to say, weight. The strongest and most consistent results are that everyone, young and old, prefers to be young. Young is much better than old, okay? And this is true around the world. We've always been told that the Chinese are famous for revering their elders, but they agree, young is better on this. And they also have a test about women in math and science. And the bias that women cannot excel in math and science is so strong that it predicts a young woman's decision to major in science better than her math SAT scores. And the stronger her bias, the lower her math test scores. Now, most people who take the test are surprised, indeed mortified by their scores. Malcolm Gladwell said he found that he was slightly biased against black people, which horrified him because his mother, he says, the person in my life who I love more than almost anyone else is black. Bertsch says, you don't choose to make positive associations with the dominant group, but you're required to. All around that group is being paired with good things. You open the newspaper, you turn on the TV, you can't escape it. It is interesting, though, that you can fudge your test if you take the race test, but ahead of time, look through pictures of Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, Colin Powell, and other luminaries, and you improve your score on the race at IAT. Then Bertsch at Yale used brain imaging technology and showed that we actually use different brain neurons to think about our group versus other people's group. And presumably, the theory is that that helped early people to identify friend from foe. Now, the understanding that this is hardwired and very scientific has actually worked to get a group of to get young men in an all-male laboratory that was taken over by Microsoft in New York. It was all-male from the vice president all the way down to the admin. And once they saw that different parts of the brain light up when you see people you think are like you, they went out and tried some totally gender-neutral interviewing techniques and changed, within 2 years, went from 0 women to 30% women. And it was the young men who found and brought the women in. Now, this is it's very easy to find on the web. You don't need it, but here it is. Now, there are no cure-alls. Claude Steele emphasized that. He says people always want the cure-all, but there's one thing he thinks we can do. He says, most people want to be hyper-good. So develop a large, what he calls a chicken soup, a mix of personal relationships on a day-to-day basis. Lots of different kinds of people you wouldn't ordinarily meet or know. Be curious about other people, and then question them about themselves. Let them know you value them and their ideas and their versions of reality, because their versions will expand our versions of reality. That said, that there are no cure-alls, and I don't mean this as a cure-all. Here are some quick take-home suggestions that experts have made about effective things that can be done fairly simply. That is, encourage a diverse roster of speakers, nip every suggestion of sexual harassment in the bud immediately. Don't let it fester. Don't let the harasser think he's gotten away with anything. Make work gender-free at every level, support quality, affordable daycare, require websites that show the quality of the PI's science and mentorship. And finally, I'd like to congratulate all of you for being willing to think about diversity. It's a complex, knotty problem that's been around for a very long time, but it has the potential to make science a true meritocracy. And thank you. I'll close with a list of some sources that I found when I was just getting into this that I found helpful, that if someone wants to do some more quick reading, these are helpful. Thank you. And do you want to take questions now, or should we?
I think we can take a time for a few questions. And so there are microphones set up. Let's see, there should be one. Yeah, there's one right there, and there's one over there. And I have, why don't we go ahead with your question, and then I have one online too.
You mentioned, oh, that's very loud.
I know, the sound is weird.
You mentioned that a good thing to do to combat gender bias is to support quality daycare and affordable daycare. What suggestions do you have for starting that at, say, a university that has no daycare whatsoever?
It has to do with the daycare suggestion, and how would you go about it if you were at a university that had no daycare?
Well, I could tell you what Ben Barris did. He's the one who said some bitchiness helps. He went in at the time they were spending all this money on a stadium, and he said to the president and the provost, I mean, it's so logical. You have all the money for a men's arena, but why not for daycare? So Stanford allocated $20,000 per parent for just daycare support. I think the best thing is if women go and men, because their father's in the same pickle, if they go together. A group is always more helpful than one. And don't think you're going to get it the first time. But you just have to keep after it. That's what Nancy Hopkins at the MIT study discovered, that as soon as the pressure let up, nothing happened. Once the pressure was applied again, then they got some action. Good luck.
Thank you.
So I have one question, time for one of the two questions that came on online, and I think I'll ask the second one. How did race, ethnicity, in addition to gender, further enhance the bias in the results you gave? So what's the role, so for women of color, how did that influence the results, and could you see?
Yeah, okay. The problem with the women of color, like the men of color, there are so few that it doesn't give you a big data set so you can see subtle things. So that's why the women's experience in biology is so helpful. When the feminist movement happened, they thought that if they could improve the status of women in science, that would elevate all of the minorities and the underrepresented groups. And that didn't happen. So now they're trying to get directly dealing with that. But because the numbers are so small and they're not getting bigger, it's a shame. We lose talent that way.
Really appreciate it. It's a great talk, Sharon.